So Rosalynde Welch moderated an afternoon session during which the goal was to maybe arrive at some consensus on if these perspectives, these new perspectives, can be synthesized into maybe some sort of a unified consensus. Don't know if she was successful at doing that or not, but
she was successful in provoking more commentary to try to clarify to the extent that there is a consensus or there isn't one, if we can clarify with her assistance what work remains to be done or how to juxtapose these models one to another. That's important work.
Yeah. So enjoy this conversation, which is some brilliant minds at work on a challenging problem.
It's, as has been evident today in this emerging model, the category of time is as important, probably more important than the category of language. As we're talking about what gets translated, it's a way of coming to grips with the past, whether that happens textually or whether that happens in some other way. We've seen two different ways in which that can get played out. Terrell suggested that the effect of Joseph's translation was to bring us into a strange world, right? Whereas Richard argued sort of conversely that the effect of his translations was instead to make that world comprehensible to us. So there are different ways that can get played out, but all of them deal with that important category of time and the confrontation, the encounter between past and present. So one question that was posed in the program here is, can the new and old paradigms of translation coexist? And I think there are a couple of ways of approaching that. One way is we can ask, can they exist as active, circulating, available possibilities within either the larger community of people who are interested in Mormonism, or more narrowly within the Mormon community itself? And to that, I want to say yes, absolutely. From my perspective, we should expect there to be multiple and competing models out there. This is what we expect in a healthy in a healthy community and in a healthy discursive community as well. So yes, I think they can coexist within a community. But then, sort of looking deeper, can they both exist in Joseph Smith's own subjective experience, right? Can he be both linguistically translating a text and sort of in a larger sense, traveling through time in a TARDIS and inhabiting various personalities? I guess you could say, yeah, right? You could say in the actual process, at times he's doing one and then at times he's doing the other. What worries me about that solution is that it isn't very rigorous, right? It's a little too convenient, and then you don't really have any principle or criteria by which you can determine what's happening at any given point in the text. So I worry a little bit about a too easy move to synthesize the two within Joseph's own experience. Despite the fact that I am a peacemaker and hate confrontation. And then finally, there are a number of other possibilities that we could evoke to let both of these models work together. Terrell suggested one, that either God or some other supernatural informant is in fact providing the content at some level, but it's doing so in the language and the forms of the 19th century. There are other different ways that we can get there. So let me open that up to the rest of the panel now. Can these two old and new paradigms coexist? Should we strive to let them coexist, or should we really want to, a battle to the death and let one emerge triumphant, so that maybe we have more coherence as an intellectual community as we approach these questions?
One of the most famous industrial statisticians of America in the 20th century is George E.P. Box. I think he's at Wisconsin. And he is best known outside of statistics for his phrase, all models are wrong, some models are useful. And I would propose that we not imagine that simultaneously Joseph Smith is doing all of these things, can't we just get along? But I think what we can do is imagine that what Joseph Smith was doing is something that's very difficult for us to model accurately with high precision. Nevertheless, it's probably worth having 3 or 4 wrong models that prove to be useful.
Well, I'd like the group to say, what is the standing of the word historicity? Are we in a way saying that the new model historicity is irrelevant, that it means nothing? Other things are going on that are more important and more true? Because that means that we're saying that most of the members of the Latter-day Saint Church are doing things that are irrelevant, because most of them believe in the historicity of the Book of Mormon. And is there any possibility of talking the way we've been talking the table up here without implicitly saying that these people are subject to an illusion? They think it's history, but it really isn't history. Something else is happening. Is it really possible for everything, for us to live together?
I'm wondering if the testimonies of the witnesses that are affixed to the Book of Mormon don't in some way serve as kind of paradigm, almost presciently anticipating this very question. I've always thought it very striking that on the one hand you have the testimony of the 8 witnesses, which is empirical and naturalistic and matter-of-fact and mundane. And then that's juxtaposed with this otherworldly, supernatural voice from heaven that testifies to the 3. It seems to be someone's way of saying, look, these 2 worlds do and can coexist. I've always been struck. I think one of the most poignant and curious moments in church history takes place when an aged David Whitmer is interviewed by the umpteenth person to interview David Whitmer. And he's reminiscing, and he says, I've been 3 times to the hill Cumorah. And every time I go, the stone box in which the plates were ensconced has washed a little further down the ravine. And I think for him, it was as real and historical, as spatio-temporal, as, the dining hall to which we resorted during lunch. It was a real, and the fact that it was so a part of his worldview that it didn't even occur to him, gosh, somebody ought to go and take possession of that stone box and preserve it for future doubting generations. So I'm kind of a diehard when it comes to, as I think already stated today, I cannot read the Book of Mormon otherwise than to see it as insistent upon its own origins in real history and in real time. But I think that it is ample and rich enough to accommodate the other kinds of prophetic inspiration and creativity that we've tried to talk about today.
I see my model as deeply compatible with historicist reading of the Book of Mormon. And I'm not remotely offended by the notion that there actually were Nephites and Lehites and the rest of the crowd, and that Joseph Smith had contact with them. So I think it's worth bearing in mind that I think almost all of the models that are being proposed are neutral on the question of historicity, which I think allows for people to, some things you're neutral about because who cares? Other things you're neutral about because if you're not neutral about it, we'll spend all of our time arguing and not be able to do other things. And I think, to your point, there is a model of historicity that says it's reasonable to seek to be neutral on it, not because it doesn't matter, but because we would like to be able to work together even if we disagree about that. And I think that can be a less dismissive approach to people who do want to focus on historicity.
Any other comments? No.
I taught a seminar that attracted on early American history that attracted someone from the literature department. And after we'd been going for a few weeks, she says, you know, it's so refreshing to be here instead of in a literature seminar. You people believe something really happened. And I think, you know, the forms of literary analysis become so subtle, and in some ways, I think very accurate and penetrating, but it sort of erases a reality, the text, and especially in that post-structural period when we were, you know, really seeing the whole world, everything, every person as a text. And so I think that sort of loosens us up. Would be one more. You know, you have to admit it's your own discipline that brought you to this point.
I'll take the blame.
Here's a question for Sam. How has your experience translating a book informed your approach to Joseph Smith's translation?
I confess I had forgotten about that. When I was young, I lived in Russia in college, and a friend said, I understand that you're a Mormon and you're a God believer and you're an American. Well, chill out. Here's Russian religion, and handed me a biography of Jesus by Alexander Myin. The best, I think, analog would probably be C.S. Lewis for us in the Anglo-American West. Brilliant, compassionate, thoughtful, egalitarian man who was murdered by their equivalent of the alt-right in 1990. And he had written a variety of interesting books and a biography of Jesus, and I read it. And I think there's something about reading in a foreign language that opens you to, I'm not a Sapir-Whorf kind of a dude, but opens you to different perspectives on concepts because you're thinking outside your native language. But I don't think that Russian is particularly X, Y, or Z, but a foreign language causes you to come at it differently. And I felt like I was learning these phenomenal things about Jesus. Now, 25 years later, I realized that Min's scholarship was actually relatively simplistic, but the soul that he brought to it was great. So as a college student, I reached out, and it turned out that his widow and his brother were still living in Moscow. And I said, hey, it's not in English. Should I put it in English? And they said, okay. So I started working on it, and I was a terrible translator at that point. And then I got a call from a prominent Eastern Orthodox clergyman who said, it's come to my attention that a Mormon is translating the masterwork of the beloved martyr of the Russian Orthodox Church. And he was very firm and very gracious, and he said, don't put any dang, that's not the Russian word, Mormons speak into this biography. So unfortunately, the combination of my incompetence and my fear of traducing the memory of this Russian martyr meant that the actual English translation is pretty clumsy. It's not particularly elegant. So that's the backstory of the having translated. For me, it was, again, this question of whether we are ever free from the constraints of language, which sneaks in the automatic aspects of our culture in ways that may make us blind. So I think for me, the reading in a foreign language allowed me to think a little bit more about the constraints on seeing, that not until today have I considered it relevant to my understanding of Joseph as seer, but maybe I'll ponder that and consider whether it's true. And then the other aspect, that translations are ultimately about communities, and both the receiving community and the possibility of a community that encompasses the receiving group and the donating group. I went to several liturgies celebrated at his church, and I went to his shrine and had dinner with his family and was just transformed. I think I wrote an essay a long time that was my first window on what maybe it might have been like to be a Mormon after Joseph Smith was killed. This sense that the world is broken, and our one possibility of fixing it is the possibility that this person we loved really has moved beyond death in a tangible way. So I thank you. I forgot all about that. I think that was an informative question.
Did Joseph use the interpreters at first, and then as he got more comfortable, did he use them less? Is there any evidence to think about or speculate on that?
Yeah, I don't have universal scripture to cite, but I don't think there's any doubt among scholars who have studied history of translation that that's precisely what happened according to many, many witnesses. And he moved further and further away from the actual contact with the plates as he progressed.
No, with the stone.
I'm sorry. With this, well, it's the same principle holds true. That there are so many references to him using the stones initially, and then by the end they disappear from the record. If there's anybody here who can correct that, I'm happy to be corrected. But I believe.
Oh, but I mean, there is some evidence, even in Nauvoo, of him using stone. So I don't think we can have a smooth
But not
model.
translating the Book of Mormon.
Oh, was the question about Book of Mormon only, or was it about the broader translation projects? I guess that's irrelevant.
Doesn't matter, just enlighten us where you can.
Oh, I think Charles' point is that is probably largely correct, although there's a real paucity of evidence to guide us clearly. It does seem clear that increasingly Joseph Smith says that there are other mechanisms by which he can know what needs to be known. But seer stones are still somewhat active in Nauvoo.
The author of that question meant to also write, so what?
I did my part.
It's you, girlfriend.
No implications to that?
Well, I mean, this gets to the one of the big questions, right? About how continuous are the treasure-seeking practices, right, of Joseph Smith's youth, and then the set of projects that often, we want to distinguish as religious, right, as opposed to magical. And there are people in this room like Mark Ashurst McGee who can answer these questions better than I can. But that seems to me a fundamental question, and it seems to me often within the Mormon community there's an imperative, weaker or stronger, right, to posit some moment of rupture, right, or break, right, when he stopped doing that thing that is really weird and we can't really account for, and started doing this other thing that we embrace and that seems more familiar to us. I do think that and it was maybe sort of smuggled into my talk, but that if we make the shift and think about, and we sort of privilege metaphysical rather than linguistic translation as the rubric under which we understand so much of what Joseph Smith is doing, I think that argues for greater continuity, right, between the early practices that sometimes get distinguished as magical, right, and then the later ones that get sort of elevated as religious. It seems to me that his identity as a scryer, right, and a certain practice of seeing. When you go back and you read some of these, I've jotted some of the. I mean, just think about these two statements, right? One. This comes from the March 1826 hearing, right, when Joseph Smith is sort of being charged as a disorderly person in conjunction with Josiah Stowell and his sort of treasure-seeking activities there. With some labor and exertion, he found the stone, carried it to the creek, washed and wiped it dry, sat down on the bank. This is describing Joseph, right? Placed it in his hat and discovered that time, space, and distance were annihilated, that all intervening obstacles were removed, and that he possessed one of the attributes of deity, an all-seeing eye, right? So those practices of scrying seem foundational, right, for what we might want to call metaphysical translation or panoramic vision, or even, I mean, if we if we want to open up the conversation more to someone like Ann Taves, who's somebody we should probably talk about at some point in her sort of account of the plates and the translation, right? This has already been sort of referenced, but Lucy Mack Smith, in the course of our evening conversations, Joseph gave us some of the most amusing recitals that could be imagined. He would describe the ancient inhabitants of this continent, their dress, their manner of traveling, the animals which they rode, the cities that they built, and the structures of their buildings with every particular, their mode of warfare and their religious worship, as specifically as though he had spent his life with them, right? So again, that notion of a set of practices associated with the early sort of treasure-seeking Joseph Smith with seer stones that involve a certain practice of seeing, right, that involves somehow moving across space and time. But that is a big question about how continuous, right, is Joseph Smith's trajectory, right, from 1823 Moroni's visitation and translation of Book of Mormon in 1830.
I do think it's worth just pausing for a moment to acknowledge that one of the fundamental ways in which our culture differs from their culture is the possibility of what some scholars are now calling abundance and what earlier scholars might have called enchantment. The possibility that there's something other than the merely physical, and that something other than the merely physical may have access to us in objects that mask in their ordinariness a great power. And hieroglyphs, as has been argued today and has been argued, I think when I was trying to figure out the grammar documents from the Kirtland era, made the argument that the hieroglyphs were themselves a kind of abundant object. In this case, not a physical object you could hold in your hand necessarily, but in some respects a physical object as it's the ink on papyri and also a visual object. So I think it's important as we try to figure out our relationship to the odder, less modern aspects of early Mormonism, both as scholars and as practitioners, to be open to the possibility that what seemed to be at stake in these odd things was the possibility of abundance or fullness or divine presence, and that we really want to be thoughtful that we're not accidentally capitulating to one of the key, I think, erroneous claims of modern secularity, that there is no fullness, there is no abundance, there is no divine or supernatural. So I think when we get all knicker-twisted about the treasure hunting stuff, we're just being embarrassed because poor people are stupid. And we should be a little bit better than that, right? Treasure hunting is poor people seeking abundance. And I'm not talking about material abundance, I'm talking about abundance as in the presence of something greater than the merely physical. And so nobody wants to be poor, good heavens, that means you're a bad person, and plus you don't get 4 iPhones. But if we can step back from that stigmatization of poverty, the reason they're treasure seeking is because they're freaking starving to death. You meet the temporal needs and people come to contact with abundant moments or with divine presence or fullness for something much greater than that. So I'm with Jared in saying, I don't know that we gain anything by this queasy stigmatization of the fact that Joseph was abundantly poor in that dual sense.
Some of these questions are directed to specific individuals, and yet I think I'll opt to present them without that specificity because all the panel, including Rosalynde and Jana, could enter into a question like this. It's potentially a religious question, but could be transposed in different octaves in secular ways or less explicitly Mormon ways, and yet is Mormon inflected here. On the practical, personal level, as a seer, Joseph traveled across time and space to inhabit the experience of ancients. Do you think that the scriptures invite each of us to do the same? Or if you want to look at that from the outside, do you think that the Mormon scriptures invite those who invest in them to do the same? In other words, how do we cultivate our own seerness?
That sounds like Rosalynde.
Again, it's not our purpose here in some ways to be explicitly bearing our testimonies, etc. And yet, if you see what I mean, that could be transposed in different octaves.
No, I mean, I think it's very clear that this idea of a kind of federation of agencies is at the coming together and cooperation of multiple agencies together for the purposes of building community is really kind of at the center of a lot of what he does. And we see that, you know, the idea of doing something for and in behalf of another individual is one that has tremendous resonance in Mormon myth and in Mormon ritual as well. And so I think there are many ways, in some ways, rationalized and domesticated a little bit, you know, in which in the present day, we, in our spiritual practice as Mormons, for those of us who inhabit the tradition, do in fact come to occupy the subjectivity and share a soul with those to whom we are sealed and linked in this great chain. We see that in the temple ordinances. We see that in many, many forms of Mormon ordinances outside of the temple as well. But I open up for other people as well.
I realize we are at a state university, and speaking of my own religious experiences is really this is not the place. But I guess what I would say is yes. My answer to that question is a very generous and enthusiastic yes. I am a convert to Mormonism as an adult, and for me it was all about the Book of Mormon. And it was, I used to meet with the sister missionaries in a graveyard, which is perhaps not the most typical place to hold visionary discussions.
Or it is, Sam would say.
Or it is, yes. Perhaps
It's the
that was
original.
Exactly
It's
the
the
right place.
original place.
the original
have the
place, yes.
conversations.
But I do remember sitting with them and saying, if I am to take this seriously and believe that this book is true, that means that this ground is not what I thought it was. The ground that we are on is somehow sacred in a way I hadn't anticipated thinking of it before. I have since, modulated my views about the geography of the Book of Mormon, so I'm not making a claim about that. But I am making a claim about claims and the claim that the text has on us if we are thinking about these questions. You asked, why does this matter? And I hope that it matters not only to people who take this book seriously as something more than just a product of the 19th century, but as your scholar colleagues, as something that can speak to us from the ground.
If I could just plug my favorite person for 12 seconds, Kate Holbrook at one of those fake funerals they held for Richard. I forget what they called them. It was like a year ago. It was a thing that Maxwell convened in honor of Richard. Mm-hmm. Kate Holbrook gave a talk that was precisely on this topic, and it's on YouTube. I think Maxwell Institute, Bushman, Kate Holbrook, maybe we'll find it.
I would just add as an observation that the model for personal revelatory and spiritual experience has shifted in our church. All right, the Book of Mormon presented a model of emphatic, individualistic, dialogic revelation. Enos is a good example of that. Actual encounter, give and take, hearing, listening, speaking. And now, if we talk about revelation in the church, it's usually in terms of the Doctrine and Covenants reference to a burning in the bosom. So it's become highly domesticated from the kind of experience of the first generation.
I'll take a crack at transposing the question into a different key that I will feel more comfortable speaking in, which is, you could pose the question as, is the Book of Mormon and is the text fashioned in such a way as to enlist you as reader in its project of translation, right? And more generally, one could say, are Joseph Smith's sort of modes of self-presentation and address do they recruit you, right, into what he's doing, or is there a kind of infectiousness, right, that in doing what he does with such bravado, does he make you feel like you could or should do that too, right? And in those terms, I would say yes. Yeah, no, I think that's fundamental to the deep structure of the text that he produces, of his. I think, but yeah, we come back, I think, to the thrill of religion making, right? One of my favorite examples from Richard's biography is when he opens a chapter with this little anecdote about Joseph Smith, sitting around a table with a bunch of his friends, and they're having a meal together, and he just stands up and he says, "I pronounce this feast after the order of the Son of God." That sort of daring, that sort of just making on the fly. Like right now, I'm consecrating this, I'm sacralizing this, I'm making this a certain kind of experience. I'm pronouncing it such, right? That seems to me to sort of shoot through pretty much everything that Joseph Smith does, and goes a long way toward explaining why there are 14 million odd people, right, who have ended up sort of joining that movement.